Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we turn back the clock to an era where the line between healing and harming was blurred. A time where the physician's touch was as likely to kill you as the disease itself. Imagine a world without antibiotics, without anesthesia, without a single sterile surgical tool. You're shivering under a coarse wool blanket, a fever gripping your body. The doctor arrives, not with a stethoscope, but with a keen eye for your urine and a willingness to bleed you with a rusty blade. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you are and what time it is for you in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie there, shivering, the cold seeping through the bed. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth fills the air. Outside, the world is a symphony of unfamiliar sounds. The creak of a cartwheel, the distant bleating of a sheep, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer. This is Tudor England, and you are sick. The year is, let's say, 1540. Your illness isn't just a bodily affliction, it's a cosmic imbalance, a moral failing, a sign that something is profoundly wrong with your place in the universe. This is the world of the four humours, the bedrock of all medical thought for over 1,000 years. It's a theory you live and die by, literally. The theory itself is elegantly simple, a beautiful, albeit deadly, piece of pseudoscience. Your body, the learned men tell you, is a microcosm of the universe. Just as the world is made of four elements, earth, air, fire and water, your body is composed of four corresponding humours: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Each humour has its own properties. Blood, associated with the heart and air, is hot and wet. Phlegm, linked to the brain and water, is cold and wet. Yellow bile from the liver and fire is hot and dry. Black bile from the spleen and earth is cold and dry. For you to be healthy, these four humours must be in perfect balance. A good physician, or at least the one who thinks he's good, is a master of restoring this delicate equilibrium. But here's the rub. If you get sick, it means one of these humours is out of whack. A fever, too much hot wet blood, a cough with phlegm, an excess of cold wet phlegm, depression, or what they called melancholy, an abundance of cold dry black bile. The remedies, therefore, are designed to correct this imbalance. Too much blood will bleed you, of course. Too much phlegm will prescribe purgatives to make you vomit or use cupping glasses to draw the excess out through the skin. Too much yellow bile, you'll be given an emetic to induce more vomiting, because nothing says healing like a good vigorous bout of nausea. This is the mainstream historical fact you need to know. Tudor medicine wasn't about fighting disease, it was about managing humours. The disease was merely a symptom of the deeper humoral imbalance. You're a bit chilly, and you find yourself coughing. This isn't just a cough, it's a signal to your family that your cold, wet phlegm is getting the upper hand. They worry about you, but their worry is rooted in a cosmology that sees your ailment as a misalignment with the stars and the seasons. The doctor who will eventually arrive, the one you'll be hearing a lot about, isn't just a physician. He's an astrologer and a moral philosopher, all rolled into one. He will consult his star charts as readily as he feels your pulse. Historians still argue whether physicians genuinely believed in the absolute predictive power of these astrological charts, or if they used them as a kind of ritual to add a veneer of learned authority to their practice. Either way, for you, the patient, the doctor's belief is irrelevant. You simply have to accept his methods. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit. Did you know that the humours were also thought to dictate your personality? This is where we get the modern words we still use today. Someone with a lot of blood was considered sanguine, cheerful, passionate, and optimistic. A person with an excess of phlegm was phlegmatic, calm, a bit slow and unemotional. Someone with too much yellow bile was choleric, hot-tempered, ambitious, and easily angered. And finally, a person weighed down by black bile was melancholic, gloomy, thoughtful, and depressed. So, your personality wasn't just who you were, it was a physical manifestation of your humoral balance. Next time you feel a bit cranky, just remember you're only channeling your inner choleric. It's a delightful way to excuse your bad behaviour, isn't it? The physician, when he finally arrives, will be a man of some means, dressed in fine clothes and carrying a silver-headed cane. He's not a grimy barber surgeon. He's a university-educated gentleman. He will ask you a series of questions, not just about your symptoms, but about your diet, your sleep, your emotional state, and even the last time you went to the privy. He's a detective of the body and soul, seeking clues to what has disrupted your internal harmony. He will look at your tongue, feel your pulse, and then, most famously, he will ask for a sample of your urine. This isn't a joke. Uroscopy, the medical examination of urine, was a crucial diagnostic tool. He'll hold the flask up to the light, swirling it, judging its colour, its clarity, and even its smell. Some physicians were so famous for their uroscopy skills that they were called piss prophets, because they seemed to be able to foretell a person's future just by looking at their pee. So here you are, a living, breathing testament to the four humours. Your sickness isn't a germ, it's a cold, wet imbalance. The cure isn't a pill, it's a deliberate attempt to drain, purge and rebalance your very essence. The physician's star chart is being consulted. The herbal remedies are being gathered, and the leeches are quite possibly being summoned. You're about to find out that Tudor medicine is less about healing the body and more about wrestling with a philosophical ghost that had been haunting Europe for 1,000 years. And as the doctor looks at your urine with a knowing nod, a shiver runs down your spine, and it's not from the cold. The shivering has given way to a clammy sweat, a different kind of misery. The doctor, your elegant physician with the silver-topped cane, has left, leaving behind a list of prescriptions that sound more like a magical incantation than a medical treatment. But wait, he was just a consultant. Now the real work begins, and the person who will be performing it is not a university man but a working-class individual with a grimy apron and a surprisingly sharp set of tools. You hear the door open and a new set of footsteps approach, heavy and deliberate. This is the barber surgeon, and you're about to have a very bad day. The barber surgeon is a crucial and often terrifying figure in Tudor life. He's not a doctor in the scholarly sense. He's a craftsman, a tradesman, someone who works with his hands. His shop, which you've likely passed 100 times, is recognisable by the iconic red and white striped pole outside. That pole is not just a quaint piece of branding, it's a brutal reminder of his trade. The red stripe symbolises the blood he sheds, the white represents the bandages he uses, and the basin at the top and bottom of the pole signifies the bowl that holds the blood and leeches. He's a man of many talents, from cutting hair to pulling teeth, from lancing boils to setting bones. His shop is a one-stop shop for all things messy and painful. You watch as he approaches, his hands calloused and his breath smelling faintly of stale ale. He's not here to discuss your humours, he's here to implement the physician's orders. In your case, it's a good, old-fashioned bloodletting. He unpacks his tools, a collection of knives, lancets, and a small saw that makes your stomach turn. The concept is simple. You have too much hot, wet blood. Therefore, some of it needs to be removed. He'll make an incision, usually in the arm or the neck, and let the bad blood drain into a bowl. Historians still argue whether bloodletting had any beneficial effects beyond a powerful placebo, but for you, it feels like a violation. The practice itself is a cornerstone of Tudor medicine, a mainstream historical fact that was embraced by all levels of society. Even a king would be bled, often to a dangerous degree. The barber surgeon's skill, or lack thereof, is something of a lottery. Some were experienced and reasonably competent, while others were little more than butchers. Amputations, for instance, were a common procedure, especially for soldiers on the battlefield or for people with infected limbs. The process was as gruesome as you can imagine. No anaesthesia, no sterile environment, just a bottle of brandy for you to bite down on, a saw, a knife, and the brute force of the barber surgeon. The limb would be sawed off, and the wound would be cauterized with a red-hot iron to stop the bleeding. The odds of you surviving such a procedure were incredibly low. The cause of death wasn't usually the surgery itself, but the subsequent infection, which would invariably set in. The barber surgeon might wash his hands, or he might not. He certainly wouldn't be using carbolic acid or any other antiseptic. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit about the barber surgeon, it wasn't just bloodletting and amputations, he was also your friendly neighbourhood dentist. A toothache was a common ailment, and the cure was always the same: extraction. He would use a rusty pair of pliers, or a special tool called a pelican, and simply rip the offending tooth out of your gum. The pain would be unimaginable, and the risk of infection was high. Some people, in a desperate attempt to avoid the barber surgeon's pliers, would resort to home remedies, like placing a maggot on the aching tooth or rubbing the gum with a piece of a dead frog. It seems the Tudor fear of the barber surgeon's chair was well founded. So here you lie, waiting for the barber surgeon to begin his work. You can't help but notice the tools he's laid out. They are not clean and they are not sterile. He might wipe them on his leather apron, but that's about it. He might even use the same blade to cut your hair and then open your vein. The concept of germ theory is centuries away, and the idea that invisible things could cause disease is pure science fiction. This is a pre-microscope world, where the humours are all that matter and dirt is just a fact of life. The barber surgeon, in his own way, is just as much a product of this worldview as the physician. He believes in what he can see and touch, in the blood he drains and the bones he sets. The work of a barber surgeon wasn't just limited to the individual patient. They also played a crucial role in public health, or what passed for it. When a plague outbreak occurred, they would be the ones tasked with lancing the buboes, the painful, swollen lymph nodes that were a hallmark of the disease. This was an incredibly dangerous job, as they would be in direct contact with the plague-ridden. Many barber surgeons died in the line of duty, their efforts often doing more harm than good. They would try to drain the buboes with crude knives, a practice that likely spread the disease rather than contained it. The very existence of the barber surgeon highlights a strange dichotomy in Tudor medicine. On one hand, you have the intellectual physician, a scholar of Greek and Roman texts who spends his time theorising about the humours. On the other, you have the practical, hands-on barber surgeon, a man of brute force and rudimentary skill. They existed in a symbiotic, if not always harmonious, relationship. The physician made the diagnosis and gave the orders, the barber surgeon carried them out. The physician was the brains, the barber surgeon was the brawn. You, the patient, were stuck between these two worlds, hoping that the intellectual theory of the one and the practical skill of the other would somehow be enough to save you. Historians still debate whether this split system of care led to better outcomes for patients, or simply gave them two different ways to suffer. As the barber surgeon ties a tourniquet around your arm, you close your eyes and try to think of anything else. You remember a joke you heard once about a barber surgeon who was so bad at his job that he was forced to cut hair for a living. It feels less funny now. The sting of the blade is a sudden, sharp shock, and you feel the warm trickle of your own blood flowing not just from your arm but from the very heart of your faith in Tudor medicine. You're being healed by a man who is as likely to use his tools on a dog as on a person, and the sheer audacity of it all is almost as shocking as the pain. The barber surgeon has left, the bandage on your arm feeling tight and a little damp. You're weaker now, the world a little hazier at the edges, but the bleeding is done for now. The physician's work, however, is far from over. He'll return, and when he does, he won't be looking at your arm, but at something far more esoteric and frankly baffling to a modern mind. You see, in a world without stethoscopes or thermometers, a doctor had to rely on his senses and his imagination to figure out what was wrong with you. This is the era of diagnosis as a performance art, a blend of observation, superstition, and educated guesswork. The main event, of course, is still the urine. Remember the doctor holding that glass flask of your pee up to the light? That wasn't just for show. This practice, known as uroscopy, was a cornerstone of Tudor diagnostics. The colour, clarity, and even the smell of your urine were considered a direct window into the state of your humours. A physician would consult a chart of urines, a visual guide that linked different shades of yellow, red, or even black to specific ailments. Dark, cloudy urine might indicate a build-up of black bile, while a bright, fiery yellow could point to an excess of yellow bile. This was a mainstream historical fact, and a physician who was skilled in uroscopy was highly respected, even if his conclusions were often pure speculation. The doctor would also look for what they called sediments in the urine, little particles that had settled at the bottom. These could be interpreted as anything from sand to blood to pus. A thick, whitish sediment might suggest a problem with phlegm. A reddish one could be a sign of too much blood. It was a kind of proto-scientific examination, but one based on a completely flawed premise. The physician didn't understand that diet, hydration, and other simple factors could dramatically change the appearance of urine. He saw a cloudy flask and concluded you had an issue with your humours, when in reality you might just be a little dehydrated. Now for a truly quirky or fringe tidbit. Some physicians would go a step further, not just looking at the urine, but also tasting it. Yes, you heard that right. A doctor might dip a finger into your flask and touch it to his tongue. He'd be looking for sweetness, which could indicate what we now know as diabetes, or for a salty taste, which might point to a different kind of humoral imbalance. Thankfully, this was not a universal practice, but it was common enough to be mentioned in medical texts of the time. The idea of a Tudor doctor giving your urine a little taste test is a wonderful and gross detail that perfectly captures the trial and error nature of the era's medicine. Beyond uroscopy, a good physician also needed to be a skilled astrologer. You see, the position of the planets and the signs of the zodiac were believed to have a profound influence on your health. Certain constellations were thought to govern different parts of the body. For example, Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, and so on. A physician wouldn't just look at you. He'd also look at the sky, or more accurately, his ephemeris, a book of astrological charts. He would calculate the position of the planets at the time your illness began, and at the time he was examining you. A difficult planet in a particular sign could explain why your ailment was so persistent. Historians still argue whether this astrological aspect of medicine was a genuine belief or a way to mystify the practice and justify charging higher fees. Either way, for the patient, it was all part of the same terrifying package. The doctor would also feel your pulse, but this wasn't just a simple count of beats per minute. A Tudor physician would feel the pulse in both your wrists at the temples and even in the neck, feeling for different rhythms, strengths, and depths. A quick, hard pulse might indicate an excess of hot, dry yellow bile. A slow, weak pulse could be a sign of a phlegmatic imbalance. The pulse was considered to be a key indicator of the body's internal state, and a skilled physician could allegedly read a person's entire medical history just by touching their wrist. It's a testament to the power of observation in an age without technology, but also a reminder of how easily a person could be misled by their own biases. Diagnosis was also a verbal exercise. The physician would ask you endless questions about your lifestyle. What did you eat? How much ale did you drink? Did you get enough sleep? Did you have a clear conscience? Illness was often seen as a punishment for sin, and a good doctor would also act as a moral guide, suggesting that perhaps your spiritual health was just as important as your physical health. The physician's role was to see you as a whole person, a body and a soul interconnected with the celestial sphere. This holistic approach, while rooted in a flawed cosmology, at least recognized that a person's life and environment played a role in their well-being. As you lie there, you can't help but feel a little ridiculous. The entire process seems so theatrical, so dramatic. A man is looking at your pee, charting the stars and asking you about your dreams. He's not talking about germs or viruses, he's talking about humours and planets. He's using words you don't fully understand, and his actions seem to have little to do with the actual physical sensation of your body. It's a reminder of how vast the gap is between the patient's experience of a disease and the doctor's theoretical understanding of it. And in this case, the doctor's theory is a beautiful, elaborate lie. The final piece of this diagnostic puzzle was often a direct observation of your bodily fluids. Not just urine, but also sweat, phlegm from a cough, and even feces. Everything you produced was a clue. The doctor would examine your phlegm for its colour and consistency. He would look at your feces for its shape and shade. It was a full sensory investigation, a testament to the belief that the body was an open book if only you knew how to read it. And for a Tudor physician, these fluids were the letters, and the book was a grand, cosmic narrative of imbalance and disharmony. It's a strange and unsettling thought. Your body's waste products are not just waste. They are a story, and the doctor is the only one who can read it. Your own misery is a dark, heavy blanket, but as you drift in and out of a feverish half-sleep, you can't help but wonder about the people who had it even worse. Not just the common folk, but the very top of the social ladder. Because if you think being a sick peasant is bad, imagine being a sick king. The pressure, the paranoia, the sheer parade of quacks and charlatans that would descend upon the royal court, each with their own bizarre remedy. We're talking about King Henry VIII, a man whose medical history is a testament to the fact that money and power couldn't buy you health in the Tudor era. In fact, they might have made it even more dangerous. Henry's most famous health struggles, of course, revolved around his leg. He suffered from what was likely a venous ulcer, a nasty persistent wound that would plague him for the last decade of his life. This was no small thing. The ulcer was said to stink so badly that it could be smelled throughout the palace, and it caused him immense pain and discomfort. It would sometimes burst open, a gruesome spectacle that would send the court physicians into a frenzy. They didn't understand the cause, and their treatments were often worse than the ailment itself. They would apply poultices made of ingredients that were more likely to cause infection than cure it. They would wrap the leg in tight bandages and then, in a moment of sheer desperation, try to drain the wound with a heated poker. A mainstream historical fact is that Henry's leg wound became a source of constant, excruciating pain, contributing significantly to his volatile temper and his increasing isolation. The king's medical care was a chaotic affair, a battleground of competing theories and personalities. His primary physician was often a highly educated man, a scholar who would consult ancient Greek texts. But Henry, ever the impatient tyrant, wasn't content with just one opinion. He would also seek out the advice of barbers, apothecaries, and even people who were essentially quacks, peddling their own bizarre remedies. One such fringe treatment involved applying a poultice made of egg whites and crocodile dung to the wound. Yes, you heard that right. Crocodile dung. It's a wonderfully quirky or fringe tidbit that reveals the desperation of the royal court and the shocking lack of a unified medical approach. The fact that a king would even consider such a thing shows just how much faith they placed in these unproven and often disgusting cures. Henry's health problems weren't limited to his leg. He suffered from crippling headaches, likely migraines, and bouts of gout, a painful inflammatory arthritis. For these ailments, his physicians would prescribe a variety of treatments, from bloodletting to herbal remedies. One of the king's physicians, a man named Dr. William Butts, was known to be a proponent of the four humours theory, and he would have approached Henry's ailments from that perspective. The gout, for instance, would have been seen as an excess of cold, wet phlegm, and the treatment would have been designed to purge that humour from his body, likely through laxatives or emetics. The king's weight was also a major health concern. As he aged, he became morbidly obese, a condition that only worsened his leg wound and his other ailments. The royal court was a place of endless feasting, and the king's diet was rich in meat and ale. His physicians, lacking any understanding of nutrition or the dangers of obesity, would have simply tried to manage the symptoms rather than address the root cause. Historians still argue whether Henry's declining health was the primary cause of his later tyrannical behaviour, or if his paranoia was a separate psychological issue. The truth is likely a blend of both, but his constant physical pain and his frustrating medical struggles undoubtedly made him a more difficult and dangerous man. You can't help but feel a flicker of pity for him, despite his reputation. Imagine being the most powerful man in England, yet you are completely powerless over your own body. You have the finest physicians in the land, yet they are all using methods that are more likely to kill you than cure you. You are a king, and you are subject to the same medical fallacies as the poorest peasant in your kingdom. The only difference is that your suffering is a matter of state, a topic of whispered conversations in the corridors of power. The royal court's medical anxieties weren't limited to Henry. The concern for succession was paramount, and the health of the royal children was a constant worry. Infant mortality rates were high, even for royalty. The children would be attended by an array of nurses, midwives and physicians, all trying to protect them from the many illnesses that ravaged Tudor society. The death of his son, Prince Edward, at the age of 15, was a devastating blow to the Tudor dynasty, and the physicians who attended him were under immense pressure to find a cure. They failed, of course, and the prince likely died of a lung infection, a disease they had no hope of treating. The whole affair is a stark reminder of the limits of Tudor medicine. Even with unlimited resources, a king was just as vulnerable as anyone else. His physicians, for all their learning, were operating in the dark, their diagnoses based on a flawed theory, their treatments often barbaric and ineffective. Henry's own experiences with his leg wound, his gout, and his other ailments are a microcosm of the entire era's medical failings. He was a man who could order the death of anyone, yet he could not order his own body to heal. It's a sobering thought, and it makes you appreciate the simple fact that you have access to a clean bandage and a bottle of pain relievers, things that even a king in the Tudor era could only dream of. As you close your eyes, you can almost hear the ghostly whispers of the royal physicians arguing over the best way to drain a king's leg or purge his humours. Their voices are filled with a desperate, learned confidence, a confidence that you now know was completely misplaced. The clammy sweat has turned into a cold, shaking chill. Your body feels like it's fighting an unseen enemy, an enemy that your learned physician and his astrological charts couldn't possibly account for. The Tudor world, you are learning, is a place where you're not just sick, you are under attack. And sometimes the attacker isn't a slow-moving, visible disease, but something fast, silent, and utterly terrifying. You're talking about the sweating sickness, a phantom plague that would sweep through England with the speed of a wildfire, leaving a trail of death in its wake. This disease was a true terror, and its rapid onset and lethality made it one of the most feared ailments of the Tudor era. The sweating sickness, or pseudo-anglicus, as the physicians of the day called it, was a uniquely English phenomenon. It first appeared in 1485, and it would return in 5 separate, terrifying outbreaks over the next 70 years. The most famous and most lethal outbreak occurred in 1528, a time when Henry VIII was desperately seeking an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. The disease didn't behave like the plague. It didn't discriminate by class or wealth. It struck the rich and the poor, the young and the old, with equal ferocity. A healthy person could be struck down in the morning and be dead by the evening. The symptoms were sudden and dramatic, a feeling of dread, followed by a severe cold fit, then a high fever, a headache, and the most distinctive symptom of all, a massive, foul-smelling sweat that would drench the victim from head to toe. The cause of the disease was a complete mystery to Tudor physicians. They had no framework to understand it. It wasn't the plague, with its telltale buboes. It wasn't the pox, with its telltale pustules. It was a new, unseen horror. They were baffled. They resorted to the old standbys of humoral theory, of course. They believed the disease was caused by a miasma, a kind of corrupt, poisonous air that was drawn into the body, upsetting the balance of the humours. This was a mainstream historical fact. The belief that disease was airborne and caused by bad smells was a fundamental aspect of Tudor medicine, and it would influence their treatments in all the wrong ways. The treatments for the sweating sickness were a catalogue of desperation and futility. Physicians, in their belief that the disease was caused by a corrupt air, would try to counteract the miasma with pleasant smells. They would advise people to carry little posies of sweet-smelling herbs or to burn fragrant woods in their homes. For the patient, the treatments were even more bewildering. In a feverish attempt to sweat out the disease, physicians would pile blankets on the patient, forcing them into an even more intense sweat. This was known as the hot regimen. The patient would be given warm drinks and encouraged to lie still, wrapped in layers of blankets, in a hot room. This, of course, was a terrible idea. It would only cause the patient to become more dehydrated, often leading to a fatal collapse. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some doctors would prescribe a drink made from a concoction of unicorn horn powder and viper's flesh. The belief was that these exotic ingredients would have powerful, almost magical, properties. Whether it was the unicorn or the viper that was meant to be the cure, historians still argue whether these were genuine medical prescriptions, or just another way for cunning apothecaries to fleece a desperate populace. The psychological impact of the sweating sickness was immense. It wasn't just the fear of death, it was the fear of a sudden, brutal death. A person could be talking to their neighbour one moment and be dead just a few hours later. The suddenness of it all shattered the social fabric. People would flee cities in panic, and there are stories of people being so terrified that they would simply lie down and die from the sheer emotional shock of it. Henry VIII himself was terrified of the disease. During the 1528 outbreak, he fled London and would travel from house to house, always one step ahead of the plague, as he believed. He would bathe in aromatic waters and take herbal remedies, doing everything he could to purify his humours and ward off the corrupt air. The mystery of the sweating sickness has continued to baffle scholars for centuries. It disappeared as suddenly as it appeared, never to return after the 1551 outbreak. The cause of it is still a subject of intense debate. Some historians believe it was a type of hantavirus, spread by infected rodents. Others think it was a form of influenza that has since gone extinct. The lack of clear evidence means that the disease remains a medical enigma, a chilling reminder of the fragility of life in the Tudor era. The fact that the disease completely vanished is a fascinating twist, as most diseases, once established, tend to linger. It's a medical ghost story, a disease that came and went, leaving nothing but a trail of fear and unanswered questions. Historians still argue whether the disappearance of the sweating sickness was due to a change in the pathogen, a shift in environmental conditions, or a development of immunity in the population. As you shiver under your blankets, you can almost feel the presence of that unseen enemy. It's not just the cough or the fever, it's the sheer terror of a world where a healthy person can be struck down in an instant. The sweating sickness is the ultimate expression of Tudor medical terror, a disease that defied all their theories and mocked all their treatments. It was a disease that proved that even a king's power was no match for a tiny invisible enemy. And as you try to get comfortable, you can't help but be thankful that the only thing you have to worry about is a bit of a fever and not a sudden, massive and ultimately fatal sweat. You're still shivering, but a new, more distant sound penetrates your feverish state. A bell, tolling with a slow, deliberate rhythm. It's not a church bell for a wedding or a market bell for a sale. It's a funereal, deeply unsettling sound that means only one thing. The plague is in town. You remember the sweating sickness, its brutal speed and mysterious nature. But the plague is a different beast entirely. It's a slow, agonizing death, and it's a horror that Tudor England knew all too well. The sound of that bell is a signal of public panic, a call to a world of quarantines, death carts and plague doctors with their bizarre bird-like masks. The plague, or the bubonic plague, was not an abstract terror. It was a cyclical reality of life. Outbreaks would occur every few decades, ravaging cities and countryside alike. The cause of the plague was, of course, a mystery. Tudor physicians, as you know, believed it was a miasma, a corrupt air caused by decaying matter, foul smells and a general lack of cleanliness. The plague was seen as the ultimate manifestation of this miasma. A mainstream historical fact is that the Tudor response to the plague was rooted in this belief. They sought to purify the air and isolate the sick, a strategy that was both logical and completely ineffective. The symptoms of the plague were unmistakable and horrifying. It began with fever and chills similar to your own. But then the dreaded buboes would appear. Large, painful, swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, or neck. These buboes, from which the name bubonic comes, were often as large as an apple and filled with pus. They were an excruciatingly painful sign that the disease had taken hold. From there, the disease would progress rapidly. The victim would develop black spots on their skin, caused by internal hemorrhaging, which gave the plague its other name, the Black Death. Death would usually occur within a week of the first symptoms, often in agonizing pain. The community's response to a plague outbreak was a frantic, desperate affair. When a house had a case of the plague, a cross would be painted on the door and the words, "Lord have mercy on us," would be scrawled beneath it. The house and its inhabitants would be quarantined for 40 days. These quarantines were often more like a death sentence than a treatment. Entire families would be locked inside, left to die of the plague, or of starvation if no one dared to bring them food. The rich would flee to the countryside, taking their entire household with them. The poor, with nowhere to go, were left to face the plague in the crowded, filthy cities. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, the most iconic figure of the plague outbreak was the plague doctor. These doctors would dress in a full-length leather coat, leather gloves, and a bizarre bird-like mask with a long beak. The beak wasn't just for show. It was filled with fragrant herbs, spices, and dried flowers. The doctor believed that this would filter the corrupt air and protect him from the plague. It was a kind of rudimentary gas mask, a beautifully theatrical and completely useless piece of medical equipment. These doctors, often poorly trained, would wander through the plague-ridden streets, offering their services for a fee. Their main task was to visit the sick, lancing the buboes to drain the poison, and offering a variety of herbal remedies. Their efforts were almost always in vain, and their terrifying appearance only added to the public's sense of panic. The streets of a plague-stricken city would have been a scene of absolute chaos. The sound of the death bell would be constant. The air would be filled with the stench of decay, a smell that everyone believed was the source of the disease. People would walk around carrying little posies of herbs or burning fragrant incense in their homes in a futile attempt to ward off the miasma. The plague doctor's mask, with its beak full of sweet-smelling herbs, was a physical embodiment of this belief. They didn't understand that the disease was carried by fleas on rats. They believed it was in the very air they breathed. Historians still argue whether the extreme quarantine measures implemented during the plague outbreaks actually helped to slow the spread of the disease. On the one hand, locking down entire houses may have contained some cases. On the other hand, the quarantines were often not strictly enforced, and the mass flight of the wealthy from the cities likely spread the disease to the countryside. The lack of sanitation, the crowded living conditions, and the rampant rat population meant that the plague was a disaster waiting to happen, and no amount of quarantine or fragrant herbs could truly stop it. The social and economic impact of the plague was immense. It would decimate populations, leading to labour shortages and social unrest. After an outbreak, the survivors would find themselves in a new world, with new opportunities and new dangers. The sheer scale of the death would have been unimaginable. Families would be wiped out and entire villages would be left empty. It's a sombre thought, a reminder that even in the midst of your own personal illness, a much larger, more terrible fate could be waiting just outside your door. You can't help but feel a flicker of gratitude that your fever isn't accompanied by the dreaded black spots or the swollen, painful buboes. Your illness in this world is a personal tragedy. The plague is a societal one. The sound of that bell is a call to a world where hope is a scarce commodity, and the only certainty is the grim reality of death. The plague doctor in his terrifying mask is a symbol of that world, a figure who represents the era's desperate, often futile, attempts to understand and control a force that was utterly beyond them. As the sound of the bell fades into the night, you pull the blankets a little tighter, hoping that your own illness, whatever it is, won't escalate into something far worse. The sound of the plague bell has faded, leaving behind the comforting, if not entirely reassuring silence of your sick room. Your physician and barber surgeon are gone for now, but their prescriptions remain. On a small table beside your bed, you see a small clay pot and a jar of dried leaves. This is the work of the apothecary, and this is where Tudor medicine moves from the abstract world of humours to the tangible and often dangerous world of plants. You're about to enter the alchemist's garden, a place where a common herb can be a cure, a poison, or a little bit of both. The apothecary was a crucial figure in the Tudor medical world. He was the pharmacist, the herbalist, and the chemist all rolled into one. His shop, filled with the smells of dried herbs, spices, and strange concoctions, was where the physician's prescriptions came to life. The apothecary was a tradesman, a member of the Guild of Grocers, and his knowledge was a blend of folk wisdom and learned texts. He wasn't as highly regarded as the university-trained physician, but his role was arguably more important in the day-to-day lives of most people. A mainstream historical fact is that the apothecary's skill was in knowing which plants to use, how to prepare them, and in what dosage. For your fever, the apothecary has prepared a decoction of willow bark, a treatment that, by a happy accident, actually works. Willow bark contains salicin, the chemical precursor to aspirin. So, while the physician and the barber surgeon were busy with their bizarre rituals, the apothecary was providing a treatment that would, at the very least, help with your pain and fever. This is a rare example of a Tudor cure that we can look back on and say, yeah, that one actually made sense. But for every willow bark there were a dozen other, far more dangerous remedies. The apothecary's garden was not a benign place. It was filled with plants that were on a razor's edge between healing and harming. Take foxglove, for example. We know now that foxglove is the source of digitalis, a powerful heart medication. In the hands of a skilled herbalist, a small, carefully prepared dose could treat a heart condition. In the hands of an inexperienced or careless apothecary, a slightly larger dose could stop the heart completely. It was a terrifying gamble, a reminder that the line between medicine and poison was incredibly thin. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit. One of the most common ingredients in the apothecary's shop was mandrake root. The mandrake plant was famous in folklore for its human-like shape, and for the belief that it would scream when pulled from the ground. This scream was said to be so powerful that it would kill anyone who heard it. To harvest it, you would have to tie a dog to the plant and then run away while the dog was pulled to its death. The mandrake root was used as a sedative and an anaesthetic, but it was also a powerful poison. The belief in its magical properties made it an incredibly valuable and highly sought-after plant, and a patient would be given a concoction of mandrake root to dull the pain of a surgical procedure. It was a mix of the truly dangerous and the purely superstitious. The apothecary also dealt in a wide range of other products, from spices and herbs for cooking to cosmetics and perfumes. His shop was a hub of commerce, and his knowledge was invaluable to the community. He would be the one to prepare poultices, ointments, and balms, using a variety of ingredients that range from the benign to the bizarre. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? The apothecary was the man who would have prepared it. He would also be the one to sell you a vial of crushed pearls, a supposed cure for melancholy, or a drink made from a unicorn's horn, a substance believed to have magical healing properties. The lines between medicine, magic, and simple commerce were blurred, and the apothecary was the one who stood at the centre of it all. The apothecary's training was a long and arduous process, usually beginning with a 7-year apprenticeship. He would learn to identify plants, to prepare them, and to understand their properties. He would also learn to read and understand the physician's prescriptions, which were often written in a kind of code or in Latin. The apothecary, in many ways, was the true practitioner of the era's medical knowledge, even if he didn't have the same social standing as the physician. Historians still argue whether the apothecary's folk wisdom and practical knowledge were more effective than the physician's academic theories, or if they were both equally useless. As you lie there, you can't help but feel a flicker of fear. The concoction you're meant to drink, the one made from the dried leaves, could be a gentle fever reducer, or it could be a slow-acting poison. You have no way of knowing. You have to trust the apothecary, a man you barely know, and a man whose knowledge is a strange blend of genuine wisdom and outright superstition. The beauty and terror of Tudor herbalism is that it was all based on observation, but that observation was coloured by folklore and a complete lack of scientific understanding. The fact that willow bark worked was a happy accident. The fact that mandrake root worked as a sedative was also an accident. But the apothecary didn't know the why. He only knew the what. He knew that if you took a bit of this, you would feel better, and if you took a bit too much of that, you would die. The thought is unsettling. Your life, your very existence, is in the hands of a man who is both a skilled herbalist and a purveyor of magical charms. You are a part of a medical system that is built on a foundation of faith, not facts. The alchemist's garden is a metaphor for all of Tudor medicine, a place of beauty and danger, of hope and despair, where the difference between a cure and a corpse can be measured in a few extra drops of a plant-based concoction. As you swallow the bitter drink, you hope that today, the apothecary chose a little bit of the former and none of the latter. Your fever has broken, and you find yourself in a state of exhausted relief. The willow bark decoction worked, or maybe the bloodletting did, or perhaps your body just fought off the illness on its own. It's impossible to know, and that's the whole point of Tudor medicine. But as you recover, you can't help but think about the fragility of the human body, not just in life, but also in death. Because in this era, even after you've passed away, your body isn't safe. The pursuit of medical knowledge, for a few enterprising and not so scrupulous individuals, often meant a trip to the local graveyard with a shovel and a bag. This is the grim reality of anatomy in the Tudor period. The study of the human body was considered essential for a physician's education. But where did the bodies come from? The answer is as macabre as you can imagine. In a world with no organ donation and a strong religious prohibition against dissecting human remains, anatomists had to get creative. The only legal source of cadavers was the bodies of executed criminals. The problem was there simply weren't enough executed criminals to meet the demand. A mainstream historical fact is that the desire to study human anatomy far outstripped the legal supply of cadavers, leading to a booming and deeply unethical trade in stolen bodies. This is where the grave robbers, or resurrection men as they were called, came in. These were hardened individuals, often working in teams who would wait for a new burial to take place, and then, under the cover of darkness, would dig up the fresh grave. They had a specific technique. They would dig at the head of the grave where the coffin was weakest, and then use a crowbar to crack open the lid. They would then pull the body out, often leaving the shroud and any valuables behind, and carry it away to be sold to an anatomist. It was a dangerous, disgusting, and incredibly lucrative profession. The anatomists who bought these bodies were often well-respected physicians and surgeons. They knew where the bodies came from, but they turned a blind eye to the illegal and immoral nature of the trade. They needed the bodies for their anatomy theatres, where they would perform dissections in front of students and a paying public. These public dissections were a rare and highly sought-after event, a blend of education and gruesome spectacle. The body would be laid out on a table, and the anatomist, often with a theatrical flair, would point out the various organs and systems. It was a way for a physician to show off his knowledge, and for the public to witness the inner workings of the human body. An act that was both fascinating and deeply taboo. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. To avoid grave robbers, People would take extraordinary measures to protect the graves of their loved ones. They would build cages of iron bars called mortsafes over the grave. They would hire guards to watch the graveyard at night. Some families would even bury their loved one in a secret location, far from the public cemetery. The fear of having your loved one's body stolen and then publicly dissected was a very real and very powerful anxiety. It speaks to a profound belief that the body, even after death, was sacred and should not be violated. The whole affair highlights a fundamental conflict in Tudor society, the clash between a new, scientific curiosity and a deeply ingrained religious belief in the sanctity of the body. The church taught that the body must remain whole for the resurrection, and the idea of a physician cutting up a human corpse was seen as a sacrilegious act. This conflict is what drove the market for grave robbing, and what forced anatomists to operate in the shadows, even as they were celebrated for their knowledge. Historians still argue whether the medical advancements made through these illegal dissections were worth the ethical cost. The legacy of these anatomists is complex. On the one hand, their work laid the foundation for modern medicine. They corrected many of the errors in ancient texts and provided a more accurate understanding of the human body. On the other hand, they did so in a way that was morally and legally questionable, preying on the grieving families of the poor and the marginalised. The bodies of the wealthy and the powerful were almost never stolen. It was always the bodies of the poor and the friendless that ended up on the anatomist's table. You can't help but feel a little unsettled by the thought. You've just survived an illness, but your body is still not entirely your own. Even in death, it could be a commodity, a subject for a public dissection. The idea of your own mortal coil being splayed open for a crowd of curious onlookers is a truly chilling thought. It's a reminder that in the Tudor era, the body was not just a vessel for your humours. It was also a battleground of competing social and intellectual forces. It was a place where science, religion, and commerce all collided in the most gruesome way possible. As you close your eyes, you can almost see the ghostly image of a lone figure with a lantern and a shovel, moving silently through a graveyard. He's not a monster in a story. He's a professional, a tradesman, just like the barber surgeon. And his trade is the one that follows you even after the final toll of the bell. It's a sobering thought, a dark end to a chapter that you've just managed to escape. You pull your blankets up a little higher, as if to protect your own fragile temporary form from the ghosts of the past and the future. You're starting to feel a little stronger, the fever a memory and the ache in your arm from the bloodletting a faint throb. But as you recover, you're reminded that your body, as a woman in the Tudor era, is a source of constant peril and vulnerability. Your health, from birth to death, is dictated by a specific set of anxieties, rituals and dangers that men would never have to face. This is the world of women's medicine, a place where childbirth is a lottery, menstruation is a humoral mystery, and contraception is a desperate, often deadly gamble. The biggest, most life-threatening ordeal for a Tudor woman was childbirth. It was a harrowing event that was a very real possibility of death for both mother and child. A mainstream historical fact is that infant and maternal mortality rates were shockingly high. The process would take place in a hot, crowded and unhygienic room, with a bevy of other women and a midwife as the main medical professional. The midwife was not a physician. She was a woman with practical experience, often a mother herself. Her knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, a blend of folk wisdom, herbal remedies, and a deep understanding of the physical process of birth. She would be the one to administer herbal concoctions to ease pain, to help with a difficult labour, and to perform any necessary physical manoeuvres. The doctor, the university-trained physician, would almost never be present. It was considered an unseemly and inappropriate act for a man to be in the birthing chamber. The woman's body was a private, mysterious space, and it was the domain of other women. This is a crucial detail, as it meant that the most dangerous moment in a woman's life was handled by people with no formal medical training, no understanding of anatomy, and no ability to perform a surgical procedure if a complication arose. If a baby was breached or if the mother was hemorrhaging, the midwife was completely powerless. Her only recourse was to pray for a miracle, now for a truly quirky or fringe tidbit. To help with a difficult birth, the midwife might use a variety of strange and superstitious remedies. A common practice was to place a stone of great power, such as a magnet or a mythical eagle stone, under the bed. The belief was that the stone would draw the baby out of the mother's body. Another remedy was to give the woman a potion made from burnt mouse parts and vinegar, a vile concoction that was believed to help with pain. These were not just desperate acts. They were a part of the cultural tapestry of women's medicine, a blend of folk magic and practical hands-on care. Beyond childbirth, a woman's body was a constant source of anxiety. Menstruation, for example, was considered a process of purging the body of excess humours. If a woman's periods were irregular or stopped altogether, it was a sign of a humoral imbalance, often seen as a build-up of bad humours. The cure? Purgatives and bleeding, of course. The physicians would prescribe a variety of herbal concoctions to bring on the menses, and a woman would be subjected to the same kind of brutal treatments as a man with a fever. The simple, natural process of menstruation was pathologized, turned into a medical problem that needed to be cured. Contraception was another dangerous, secretive aspect of a woman's life. With no reliable birth control, a woman was at the mercy of her fertility. While there were no safe methods, there were plenty of unsafe ones. Women would use a variety of herbal remedies, some of which were effective but incredibly dangerous. Plants like tansy and rue were used as abortifacients, but the dosage was a gamble, and a woman who took too much could easily die from the poisoning. Historians still argue whether the use of these herbal abortifacients was a common practice or a desperate last resort, but their very existence speaks to the profound vulnerability of a woman's life. The world of women's health was also a world of secrets and whispers. A woman would confide in her midwife, her mother, or her closest female friends. The doctor was for the humours, but the midwife was for the body. The midwife, in many ways, was a woman's lifeline, a person she could trust with her most intimate and terrifying moments. She was the one who would hold her hand during labour, the one who would clean the newborn baby, and the one who would tend to her if she survived. Her presence was a comfort and a necessity. The lack of understanding about women's anatomy was profound. Physicians believed that the uterus was a wandering organ, and that it could move around the body, causing all sorts of ailments. This was known as a suffocation of the mother, and the cure was to apply foul-smelling substances to the woman's nose to drive the uterus back down, or to apply sweet-smelling substances to the pelvic region to lure it back into place. It's a ridiculous theory, but it was a widely held belief, a testament to how little was known about the female body. As you lie there, you can't help but feel a flicker of gratitude for the modern world. You are a woman, but your body is no longer a mystery to be solved with magnets and burnt mice. Childbirth is no longer a death sentence. Menstruation is no longer a humoral imbalance. And contraception, while still a complex topic, is no longer a desperate gamble with poisonous herbs. The Tudor era was a world where a woman's body was a constant source of danger, a place where her most profound moments were also her most terrifying. You have survived your illness, but you know that if you were to have a child in this era, your journey of survival would just be beginning. The ache in your arm is gone, and the fever is a distant, unpleasant memory. You've survived, but your recovery is slow. As you sit up in bed, you hear the distant sound of children playing in the street, their laughter a fragile and fleeting thing. You're reminded that your survival is, in many ways, an anomaly. Because in the Tudor era, the greatest risk of all wasn't the plague or the sweating sickness. It was simply being a child. The world of childhood was a fragile and dangerous one, and the medical treatments for children were often as perilous as the diseases themselves. The first great danger was birth itself, as we discussed. But even if you survived the birthing chamber, the road ahead was fraught with peril. A mainstream historical fact is that infant mortality rates were incredibly high. Up to 1/3 of all children would not live to see their 10th birthday. They would die of a variety of ailments that we now consider minor: measles, whooping cough, or a simple fever that a modern child would shake off with a dose of paracetamol. These diseases, in a world without antibiotics and with a fundamental misunderstanding of the cause of illness, were a death sentence. The medical treatments for children were a mix of common sense and sheer madness. For a fever, a child might be given a decoction of herbs, or more likely they would be bled with a tiny lancet. The humoral theory applied to children just as it did to adults. A fever was too much hot, wet blood, and the only way to fix it was to remove some of the excess. The barber surgeon, with his sharp knives and clumsy hands, was a terrifying figure for a small child. The idea of bleeding a sick, fragile child is horrific to a modern mind, but in the Tudor era, it was a routine and accepted practice. Now for a truly quirky or fringe tidbit about childhood sicknesses. A common cure for whooping cough was to take the child and pass them under the belly of a donkey. The belief was that the cough would be transferred to the animal. Another cure for a fever was to place the child's head in a sack with a live rooster, or to feed them a potion made from the boiled, crushed bodies of woodlice. These remedies, a blend of folk magic and animal cruelty, were not just a desperate last resort. They were a part of the accepted medical folklore. They speak to a profound sense of helplessness in the face of childhood disease. The fear of childhood illness was not just a medical problem, it was a social one. A family would have many children knowing that only a few would survive. The grief of losing a child was a common experience, so common that it was often normalised. A parent would not become as emotionally attached to their children as we do today, because the constant threat of death made a deep attachment too painful. This is not to say that parents didn't love their children. They did, but their love was tempered by the grim reality of infant mortality. Historians still argue whether this emotional detachment was a coping mechanism or a genuine lack of feeling. The truth, as always, is likely somewhere in the middle. Childhood itself was not a long, protected period. Children were considered small adults, and they were put to work from a very young age. They would work in the fields, in the workshop, or in the household, their small bodies subjected to the same rigours as the adults. They were not seen as innocent, precious beings. They were seen as a source of labour, and a child who was too weak or too sick to work was a liability. This attitude, combined with the high mortality rates, created a world where childhood was a brief and perilous journey. The lack of understanding about childhood illnesses was profound. A child with a rash might be bled, a child with a cough might be given a potion of woodlice, and a child with a simple stomachache might be given a powerful purgative that would do more harm than good. The physicians had no concept of dosage for children. They would simply scale down the adult treatments, with often fatal results. The fragility of the child's body was not fully understood, and the treatments, while well-intentioned, were often a testament to the brutal one-size-fits-all nature of Tudor medicine. As you sit there, you can't help but think of the children you've seen in the streets. You've seen them with runny noses and hacking coughs, with sores on their faces and with bellies swollen from malnutrition. You've also seen the little wooden coffins carried by their grieving parents to the churchyard. The deaths were so common that they were just a part of the daily rhythm of life. The laughter you hear outside is a precious, fleeting thing, a moment of joy in a world that is fundamentally hostile to the young. You're an adult, and you have survived. But you are a survivor in a world that is filled with the ghosts of children. You know that for every adult who is recovering from an illness, there are a dozen children who are not. The children, with their fragile bodies and their fleeting lives, are the true victims of Tudor medicine. They are the ones who were bled for a fever, fed woodlice for a cough, and passed under a donkey for whooping cough. Their suffering is a silent testament to an era that was more about surviving than thriving. The laughter outside is a reminder that even in this grim world, a child's spirit can still find a way to shine, if only for a little while. Your slow recovery continues, a gentle unfolding of strength and vitality. But as you're confined to your room, you're reminded that not everyone has the luxury of a warm bed and a caring family. You've been attended by a physician and a barber surgeon, and you've had an apothecary's concoction. But what about the poor, the destitute, the sick without a home or a family? In the Tudor era, a sick person without means had a very different and much grimmer path to follow. This is the world of the almshouse and the charitable hospital, a place where care was a blend of Christian charity, social control, and a terrifyingly brutal reality. The Tudor period saw the dissolution of the monasteries, which had for centuries been the primary source of care for the poor and the sick. This created a massive void, a social crisis that the government was forced to address. The solution was the creation of a new system of care, a blend of charitable institutions and government-run almshouses. A mainstream historical fact is that the focus of this new system was not just on healing the sick, but also on containing them and on preventing them from becoming a burden on the rest of society. The most famous of these new institutions was St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, which was refounded by King Henry VIII in 1546. This was a place where the sick poor could go for treatment. But it was not a place of comfort or specialised care. It was in many ways a holding pen. The patients would be cared for by a small staff of nurses and would be subject to the treatments of the physicians who were attached to the hospital. The care was rudimentary and often brutal. Patients would be bled, purged and given herbal remedies, but they would do so in a communal setting, often in a large open ward with dozens of other sick people. The conditions were unhygienic, and the risk of cross-infection was incredibly high. The almshouse was a different kind of institution entirely. It was not a hospital for the sick, but a place for the elderly, the poor and the destitute. It was a place for people who could no longer work and who had no family to care for them. The almshouse was often funded by a local church or a wealthy benefactor, and it was a form of social welfare. The residents would be given a small stipend, a place to sleep, and a basic level of care. But the almshouse was also a place of strict discipline. The residents would have to follow a strict set of rules, attend church services, and often perform small tasks. It was a place of charity, but it was also a place of control. Now for a truly quirky or fringe tidbit about the poor and the sick. One of the most common and widely used remedies for the poor was pauper's medicine, a kind of folk remedy that was passed down from person to person. A pauper's medicine for a cold might be a concoction of boiled onions and honey. A remedy for a stomachache might be a drink made from a variety of common herbs. These remedies were not prescribed by a physician or an apothecary. They were a form of self-care, a desperate attempt to heal oneself in a world without access to professional medical help. The effectiveness of these remedies was, of course, a complete lottery, but for the poor they were often the only option. The sick poor were a source of both pity and fear. They were pitied for their suffering, but they were feared for their potential to spread disease. In a plague outbreak, a sick person without a home was seen as a danger to the entire community. They would be driven out of the city, or they would be quarantined in a pest house, a remote, isolated building where the sick were sent to die. These pest houses were a truly horrific place, with no care, no comfort, and no hope. They were a testament to a society that, in its fear, was willing to abandon its most vulnerable members. The whole system of care for the poor highlights a fundamental contradiction in Tudor society. On the one hand, there was a strong Christian belief in charity and the importance of helping the sick. On the other hand, there was a fear of social disorder and a desire to control the poor and the sick. The almshouse and the hospital were a physical manifestation of this contradiction. They were a place of charity, but they were also a place of containment. The poor were given care, but they were also stripped of their freedom and their autonomy. Historians still argue whether the dissolution of the monasteries was a good thing for the poor. On the one hand, it led to the creation of a more organised secular system of care. On the other hand, it replaced a system of personal, individualised charity with a system of institutionalised, impersonal control. As you lie there, you can't help but feel a pang of guilt. You're recovering in a warm, comfortable bed, attended by professionals. The thought of a sick person lying in a communal ward with dozens of others, or worse, left to die alone in a pest house, is a chilling one. You are a survivor, but you are a survivor of a different kind of illness, a kind that a doctor and an apothecary could at least attempt to treat. The poor, with their pauper's medicine and their pest houses, had a different kind of illness entirely, the illness of being without means, and for that illness there was no cure. The bell you heard for the plague was a bell for everyone. But the bell for the poor was a bell that only they could hear, a silent, daily tolling of their suffering. You're well enough now to sit up and feel the sun on your face, a gentle warmth that speaks of healing and new life. But as you do, you're reminded of a different kind of pain, a constant nagging and often excruciating pain that afflicted people in the Tudor era, toothaches. We've talked about the barber surgeon and his many gruesome talents, but his work as a dentist was perhaps the most brutal of all. Tudor dentistry was a world of crude tools, no anaesthesia, and a profound lack of understanding about the cause of dental decay. It was more about managing pain than it was about preserving a tooth, and for you it would have been a truly horrifying ordeal. A toothache wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a major health problem. It could lead to infection, a swollen face, and an inability to eat. It was a sign, of course, of a humoral imbalance, too much cold, wet phlegm, or some other such nonsense. The treatments were often a desperate attempt to deal with the symptoms, not the cause. A mainstream historical fact is that the go-to solution for a bad tooth was always extraction. A Tudor barber surgeon would see a rotten tooth, and his only thought would be to remove it. The extraction process was a sight to behold. The barber surgeon, with his burly physique and his rusty tools, was more like a blacksmith than a medical professional. He would have a variety of tools, from simple pliers to a more sophisticated tool called a pelican, named for its resemblance to a pelican's beak. The pelican was a terrifying device, a kind of lever that would be placed on the gum and used to yank the tooth out. There was no anaesthesia, no Novocaine, nothing but a lot of pain and a lot of blood. The patient would be held down by a couple of burly assistants, and the barber surgeon would set to his work. The sound of the pliers, the cracking of the bone, the sheer violence of the act. It was a visceral, brutal, and deeply traumatizing experience. Now, for a truly quirky or fringe tidbit about Tudor dentistry. If you couldn't afford a barber surgeon, or if you were simply too terrified to go, you could try a variety of home remedies. A common cure for a toothache was to rub the tooth with the foot of a dead mole, or to place a live maggot on the gum. Another remedy was to make a paste of crocodile dung and vinegar and apply it to the tooth. Yes, that's the second time we've heard about crocodile dung, which suggests it was a surprisingly popular, if entirely useless, ingredient in Tudor medicine. The use of these bizarre remedies speaks to a profound fear of the barber surgeon's chair and a desperate hope that some kind of folk magic would be enough to cure the pain. The poor were the most at risk of losing their teeth. Their diet, often lacking in nutrients and rich in sugars, was a breeding ground for decay. They couldn't afford the luxury of a physician, or even a barber surgeon, so they would often have to resort to home remedies. A peasant with a bad tooth would simply have to suffer in silence, or, in a moment of desperation, try to pull the tooth out themselves with a pair of pliers. It was a kind of self-mutilation, a last resort in a world without access to proper medical care. The pain of a toothache was a constant, chronic reality for many, and the sight of a person with a swollen jaw or a missing tooth was a common sight. The rich, of course, had more options, but their dental care wasn't much better. They might have a barber surgeon who was a bit more skilled, or they might be able to afford the services of a travelling dentist, a kind of quack who would sell a variety of elixirs and powders that promised to cure all dental ills. These dentists were often charlatans, but they were a welcome alternative to the brute force of the barber surgeon. Some of the wealthier Tudors would even have their rotten teeth replaced with false teeth made of bone or ivory. These were often uncomfortable and unhygienic, but they were a sign of status, a way of showing that you could afford to replace what nature had taken away. The whole affair highlights a fundamental contradiction in Tudor dentistry. On the one hand, there was a growing awareness of the importance of oral hygiene. People would use a variety of powders and sticks to clean their teeth. On the other hand, there was a profound lack of understanding about the cause of decay. They didn't know about bacteria or cavities. They just knew that some teeth got rotten and painful. Historians still argue whether the Tudor era was the beginning of modern dentistry or a last brutal gasp of the old ways. As you sit there, you can't help but feel a phantom ache in your own teeth. You're lucky to have a toothbrush and toothpaste, and you're lucky to have a dentist who can fill a cavity. In the Tudor era, a cavity was a death sentence for a tooth, and the only solution was a visit to the barber surgeon. The thought of that pelican, that rusty, brutal tool, makes you clench your jaw. The simple fact that you have a full set of teeth is a testament to the advances of the last few centuries. The sound of a tooth being yanked out is a sound you'll never hear, and for that you are eternally grateful. You've survived the fever, the bloodletting, and the plague, but a toothache in the Tudor era might have been the one thing that truly broke you. Your recovery has reached a new milestone. You're able to walk a little, to take a gentle turn about the garden. The world is coming back into focus, but as it does, you notice things you didn't see before. You notice the people who are not like you, the people whose minds have, according to Tudor beliefs, been touched by the moon. This is the world of madness, and in the Tudor era, it was a world of profound fear, brutal treatment, and a complete lack of understanding. A person with a mental illness was not just sick, they were often seen as possessed, a danger to themselves and to others. The Tudor understanding of madness, of course, was rooted in the theory of the four humours. Melancholy, the most common form of mental illness, was a classic case of a humoral imbalance. Too much cold, dry black bile. The cure, therefore, was to purge the black bile. This was done with a variety of violent and often dangerous methods. A mainstream historical fact is that the treatment for madness was often a form of physical discipline, a way of shocking the person back to sanity. This would involve everything from bloodletting and purging to immersion in cold water and beatings. The belief was that the madness was a physical ailment, and that by shocking the body, You could shock the mind back into its rightful place. A person who was melancholic would be bled, often to the point of collapse, in a desperate attempt to drain the excess black bile. They would be given powerful laxatives and emetics, and they would be subject to a diet that was meant to correct their humours. The treatments were based on a deeply flawed premise, and they often did more harm than good. They would leave the person weak, traumatised, and often more unwell than they were to begin with. Now, for a truly quirky or fringe tidbit. One of the most famous treatments for madness was a form of trephining, a surgical procedure that involved drilling a hole into the person's skull. The belief was that the hole would allow the bad air or the evil spirits that were causing the madness to escape. This was, of course, a profoundly dangerous procedure, and a person who survived it would likely have suffered a traumatic brain injury. The fact that this was considered a legitimate medical treatment speaks volumes about the desperation of Tudor medicine. The fact that the barber surgeon would be the one to perform this procedure is even more chilling. For a person with a more violent or disruptive form of madness, the treatment was often institutionalization. This is where we get the origins of asylums. The most famous of these was Bethlehem Hospital, or Bedlam, a place that, even in the Tudor era, had a terrifying reputation. Bedlam was not a place of care, it was a place of containment. The patients were often chained, beaten and starved, and they were subject to the whims of their keepers. The conditions were horrific, and the place was often a destination for a macabre kind of tourism. For a small fee, a person could go to Bedlam and watch the lunatics, a form of entertainment that speaks to a profound lack of empathy and understanding. The poor were the most at risk of being sent to Bedlam. A wealthy person with a mental illness would be cared for at home, often in a locked room, but a poor person with no family would be sent to the asylum. The asylum was a place for the friendless, the homeless, and the forgotten. It was a place that was meant to be a solution to a social problem, but it was, in reality, a place of profound suffering. Historians still argue whether Bedlam was a place of genuine care or a place of outright cruelty. The truth is likely a mix of both, but its reputation as a place of terror is well earned. The whole affair highlights a fundamental conflict in Tudor society. On the one hand, there was a belief that a person with a mental illness was a human being who was suffering from a physical ailment. On the other hand, there was a profound fear of the unknown and a willingness to resort to brutal and violent methods to cure them. The person with a mental illness was a paradox, a person who was both sick and dangerous. The treatments they were subjected to were a reflection of this paradox. They were bled and purged, as if their illness was a physical one, but they were also chained and beaten, as if their illness was a moral one. As you walk in the garden, you see a man muttering to himself, his clothes in disarray. He is, to you, a person who is suffering, but to a Tudor physician, he is a person with an excess of black bile, a person who needs to be bled, purged, and disciplined. The thought of what would happen to him in this era is a chilling one. You've survived the fever and the toothache, but a mental illness in the Tudor era was a far more terrifying ordeal. It was an illness that stripped you of your humanity, your dignity, and your very sanity. It was an illness that made you a spectacle, an object of fear and pity, and a person who was more likely to be chained than to be comforted. The whispers of the man in the garden are a reminder that some terrors are not just of the body but of the mind, and that for those terrors there was often no cure at all. You're a bit stronger now. The garden walk a daily ritual that feels more like a privilege than a chore. As you pass a group of wealthy ladies, you can't help but notice their faces. They're a canvas of artifice, their skin a ghostly white, their lips and cheeks a vibrant red. You're reminded that Tudor medicine wasn't just about curing the sick, it was also about enhancing beauty. But for these women, and for you if you were to follow their lead, the pursuit of beauty was a dance with death, a daily application of toxic ingredients that would slowly but surely poison you. This is the world of cosmetics, a place where the desire for a youthful appearance was stronger than the fear of a slow, agonizing death. The ideal of beauty for a Tudor woman, especially a wealthy one, was a face as white as a lily and lips and cheeks as red as a rose. This was a look that was not achieved naturally. It was achieved with a variety of pastes, powders and paints, all of which were incredibly dangerous. A mainstream historical fact is that the main ingredient in the most popular facial whiteners was ceruse, a lead-based cosmetic that would slowly poison the user. Ceruse was a paste made of white lead and vinegar, and it was applied to the face to create a ghostly, porcelain-like complexion. It would dry to a smooth, matte finish that was highly sought after. But lead is a powerful neurotoxin, and a woman who used ceruse on a daily basis would be slowly poisoning herself. The lead would be absorbed through the skin, causing a variety of health problems, from headaches and hair loss to muscle paralysis and memory loss. In a tragic twist, the lead would also eat away at the skin, causing blemishes and a greying complexion, which would then require even more ceruse to cover up. It was a vicious cycle of self-destruction, all in the name of beauty. Now, for a truly quirky or fringe tidbit, to get that rosy red look on their lips and cheeks, women would use vermilion, a paint made from cinnabar, which is a mineral containing mercury sulfide. Mercury, as we now know, is another powerful toxin. A woman who used vermilion would be slowly poisoning herself with mercury, a poison that can cause tremors, memory loss, and mental instability. The fact that a woman would use both lead and mercury on her face on a daily basis is a testament to the power of social pressure and the lack of understanding of chemistry and its effects on the body. The pursuit of beauty wasn't limited to the face. The eyebrows, for example, were often plucked to a thin, barely there line, and the forehead was shaved to create a higher hairline, a look that was considered to be a sign of intelligence and breeding. To get rid of unwanted hair, women would use a variety of depilatories, some of which were made of arsenic and other poisons. The desire for a beautiful, fashionable appearance was a constant and often lethal endeavour. The use of these toxic cosmetics was a class issue. A poor woman could not afford the expensive lead and mercury paints, and she would often have a more natural, if not always healthy, complexion. A wealthy woman, with her ghostly white skin and her rosy red cheeks, was a walking, breathing testament to her social status and her wealth. The pursuit of beauty was a form of self-branding, a way of showing the world that you were rich enough to afford the most fashionable, and, in this case, the most dangerous products. Historians still argue whether women in the Tudor era were aware of the dangers of these cosmetics. On the one hand, there were a variety of medical texts that warned about the dangers of lead and mercury. On the other hand, the pressure to conform to the beauty standards of the day was immense, and the desire to be beautiful often outweighed the fear of a slow and painful death. The perfumes of the era were no better. They were often made from a variety of strong, musky scents that were meant to mask the stench of a society without indoor plumbing and without a concept of daily bathing. The perfumes would be made with a variety of strong, often exotic ingredients, and they were also a class issue. A wealthy woman would have access to the finest perfumes, while a poor woman would have to rely on the simple scent of herbs and flowers. The whole affair of Tudor cosmetics and perfumes is a reminder that in this era, everything was on a continuum, a scale of wealth and a scale of danger. As you sit there, you can't help but feel a flicker of sympathy for these women. They were victims of their own time, trapped by a social and cultural ideal of beauty that was literally killing them. They were poisoned by the very products they used to make themselves beautiful. You've survived the fever, the bloodletting, and the threat of the plague. But a woman's battle in the Tudor era was far from over, even in the absence of a disease. It was a battle with her own appearance, a battle with the expectations of her society, and a battle with the poisonous chemicals that she would apply to her skin every single day. The ghostly white faces of the women in the garden are not a sign of beauty. They're a sign of a slow, beautiful death. You're well enough now to sit up, to read, and to think. And as you do, your mind turns to the source of all this medical chaos, the doctor himself. Who was he, this learned man with the silver-topped cane and the star charts? Where did he get his knowledge, and why was it so often wrong? The answer lies in the university, a place of ancient texts, theoretical learning, and a profound disconnect from the messy physical reality of the human body. The Tudor physician's training was a long and arduous path, but it was a path that, in many ways, led to a dead end. The road to becoming a physician began at university, usually at Oxford or Cambridge. It was a long 7 to 9 year process that was more about philosophy than it was about medicine. The students would spend their days in dusty lecture halls, listening to professors drone on about the works of ancient Greek and Roman medical authorities, most notably Galen and Hippocrates. These ancient texts, which were over 1,000 years old, were the gospel of Tudor medicine. They were not to be questioned or challenged. A mainstream historical fact is that the Tudor physician's education was based on a system of rote memorization and unquestioning acceptance of ancient authority, rather than on empirical observation and scientific inquiry. The students would learn all about the four humours, the theory of miasma, and the relationship between the body and the celestial sphere. They would learn to read the stars and to interpret urine. They would learn all the theoretical aspects of medicine, but they would learn almost nothing about the practical application of it. They would learn about anatomy from texts and diagrams, but they would rarely, if ever, see a real human body. The dissection of a human corpse, as we know, was a rare and often illegal act, and it was not a part of a physician's formal education. The physician was, in many ways, an armchair doctor, a man of theory who had little to no hands-on experience. Now, for a truly quirky or fringe tidbit, the university medical curriculum was so disconnected from reality that a physician could graduate with a deep theoretical knowledge of the body, but have no practical skills whatsoever. The barber surgeon, with his 7-year apprenticeship and his daily hands-on work, was in many ways a more skilled and practical medical professional. But he lacked the social status and the intellectual authority of the university-trained physician. The physician was the brains, the barber surgeon was the brawn, and the patient was caught in the middle. The physician would make the diagnosis, and the barber surgeon would carry out the work, a relationship that was both symbiotic and deeply flawed. The physician's training also involved a heavy dose of astrology. He would learn to read star charts and to understand the influence of the planets on the body. A good physician was a good astrologer. He would be able to predict the course of an illness based on the position of the planets, and to prescribe a treatment that was in harmony with the celestial sphere. This was not a side hobby. It was a fundamental part of a physician's job. The belief that the universe was an interconnected whole, and that the stars had a direct influence on the human body, was a cornerstone of Tudor cosmology and medicine. Historians still argue whether this reliance on astrology was a genuine belief or a clever marketing ploy to give the physician an air of learned mystique. The lack of practical training was a major problem. A physician would graduate with a degree in medicine, but he would have no experience in setting a bone, lancing a boil, or performing a surgical procedure. These were the tasks of the barber surgeon. The physician's role was to diagnose, to prognosticate, and to prescribe. He would write a prescription for the apothecary to fill, and he would give a command to the barber surgeon to bleed or purge. He was a manager, a theorist, a man who worked with his mind, not with his hands. This is why the barber surgeon, for all his lack of status, was often a more important figure in the day-to-day lives of most people. The physician's education was also incredibly expensive, and it was a path that was only open to the sons of the wealthy. A poor boy, no matter how intelligent, could not dream of becoming a physician. He could, however, become a barber surgeon, and he could, through hard work and a bit of luck, earn a decent living. This class divide in medicine was a crucial aspect of Tudor society. The rich had access to the theoretical university-trained physician, while the poor had to make do with the hands-on, often brutal, care of the barber surgeon. As you sit there, you can't help but feel a certain sense of absurdity. The man who diagnosed you, the man who looked at your urine and consulted the stars, was a man who had never held a scalpel. He was a man who knew a great deal about Galen and Hippocrates, but who knew very little about the real, living, breathing human body. You've survived his diagnosis, his prognosis, and his prescription, but you're aware that your survival was more of a lottery than a science. The Tudor physician, for all his learning and his prestige, was, in many ways, an intellectual fraud, a man who had more in common with an astrologer than he did with a modern doctor. You're grateful for the willow bark, but you know that the man who prescribed it was likely just guessing. The whole affair is a wonderful and terrifying reminder that in the Tudor era, the person who was most likely to heal you was also the person who was most likely to kill you. And that person was a man who had never even seen a dissection, a man who had a degree in theory and a profound lack of practical skill. You're walking in the garden now, your health restored, but your mind is still in the Tudor era, and you're starting to think beyond the confines of your village. What about the world beyond? What about the sailors, the explorers, the men who would spend months or even years at sea? Their health challenges were unique, brutal, and often completely misunderstood. A sailor in the Tudor era was a man on a fast track to a variety of terrifying ailments, and for him, the physician's elegant theories were useless. He was a guinea pig for the most desperate and brutal of medical treatments. The greatest terror for a sailor was not a storm or a shipwreck, it was scurvy. Scurvy was a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, a vitamin that a Tudor sailor, with his diet of hardtack, salt pork and ale, would have almost no access to. The symptoms were horrifying and often fatal. A sailor with scurvy would first feel a general weakness and lethargy. Then his gums would swell, his teeth would fall out, and his joints would become so painful that he couldn't walk. His skin would erupt in dark, bruised patches, and his old wounds, even those that had healed years ago, would reopen. It was a slow, agonizing death, and it was a constant reality on long voyages. A mainstream historical fact is that scurvy was a major cause of death for Tudor sailors, often decimating the crew of a ship before it even reached its destination. The cause of scurvy was a complete mystery to Tudor physicians. They didn't understand the concept of a vitamin deficiency. They believed the disease was caused by a variety of things: the bad air of the sea, the salty diet, or even a kind of humoral imbalance brought on by the damp, cold environment of the ship. Their treatments were, of course, completely ineffective. They would bleed the sailors, as was their custom. They would give them purgatives and emetics. They would try to correct the sailors' humours, all while the sailor was dying a slow, painful death from a simple lack of citrus. Now for a truly quirky or fringe tidbit. One of the most common treatments for scurvy was a concoction of various plants, often wild herbs that were gathered on land. The belief was that the plants had some kind of magical property that could heal the body. A common remedy was a drink made from the juice of scurvy grass, a plant that was thought to have a special power against the disease. The funny thing is, scurvy grass is a good source of vitamin C, so, in a stroke of accidental brilliance, the Tudor sailor was sometimes given a cure that actually worked, but for all the wrong reasons. The physician didn't understand why the scurvy grass worked. He just knew that it sometimes did. It's a wonderful example of a cure that was effective for reasons that were completely unknown at the time. The ship's doctor, if a ship was lucky enough to have one, was not a university-trained physician. He was a barber surgeon, a man who would be tasked with the daily care of the crew. His job was to lance boils, set broken bones, and in a moment of sheer brutality, amputate a mangled limb. He was a man of brute force and rudimentary skill, a man who worked with a bloody apron and a rusty set of tools. His knowledge was based on his experience, not on ancient texts, and for a sailor, he was both a terrifying figure and a lifeline. The thought of a major surgery on a ship, in a cramped and rocking cabin, with no anaesthesia and no sterile instruments, is a chilling one. The lack of sanitation on a Tudor ship was a breeding ground for a variety of diseases. The bilge water would become a festering cesspool of bacteria, and the crew's living conditions were cramped and unhygienic. Dysentery, typhoid, and a variety of other fevers were a constant threat. The barber surgeon had no understanding of germs, and his only tools were a mix of herbal remedies and violent purges. A sailor who became sick was in many ways a dead man walking. The ship was a contained environment, and once a disease took hold, it would spread with a terrifying speed, often decimating the entire crew. Historians still argue whether the high death rates of Tudor exploration were more due to disease than to shipwreck or combat. The evidence suggests that disease was, in fact, the more lethal enemy. The whole affair highlights a fundamental contradiction in Tudor society. On the one hand, they were building a global empire, sending ships to the far corners of the earth. On the other hand, their medical knowledge was so primitive that they couldn't even cure a simple vitamin deficiency. The ship was a microcosm of Tudor medicine, a contained environment where all the theories of the physician and all the skills of the barber surgeon were put to the test, and often they failed. The sailors were the true heroes of Tudor medicine. They were the ones who were subjected to the most brutal treatments, the ones who were the guinea pigs for every quack cure, and the ones who, through sheer force of will, sometimes survived. As you walk in the garden, you can't help but feel a flicker of sympathy for these men. They were brave and they were bold, but they were also victims of a medical system that was completely unequipped to deal with their reality. The thought of a sailor, with his teeth falling out and his old wounds reopening, is a haunting one. He was a man who was fighting a battle on two fronts, the storm and the sea on the outside, and the disease and the incompetence of the ship's doctor on the inside. You have survived your illness, but you know that for a sailor in the Tudor era, your luck would have run out long ago. The sea was a cruel and unforgiving mistress, but in the Tudor era, the ship's doctor was often a more dangerous adversary. You've survived, and you're back in the rhythm of daily life, but your perspective is forever altered. You see the world through a different lens, a lens that shows you the fragility of life and the brutality of Tudor medicine. As you walk through the crowded, bustling streets, you can't help but think about the people who weren't so lucky. The people who ended up in the ultimate medical institution of the era, the hospital. And you're reminded that the Tudor hospital was not a place of healing. It was in many ways a place of a final communal horror, a place that was more likely to kill you than to cure you. The Tudor hospital, as we touched on with St. Bartholomew's, was a far cry from its modern counterpart. It was not a sterile environment with a team of trained nurses and doctors. It was, in many ways, a pest house with a charitable front. A mainstream historical fact is that the Tudor hospital was a place of last resort, a place for the sick poor who had nowhere else to go. The wealthy would be cared for in their own homes, attended by a physician and a bevy of servants. The poor, with no home and no family, would be sent to the hospital, a place that was both a symbol of Christian charity and a testament to the lack of sanitation and hygiene. The conditions inside the hospital were a nightmare. The wards were large, open rooms with dozens of beds, often filled with multiple patients. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste and decaying flesh. There was no concept of quarantining patients with different diseases. A person with a fever might be lying next to a person with a festering wound, and the risk of cross-infection was incredibly high. The nurses were often untrained and overworked, and their main job was to provide basic care and to administer the doctor's prescriptions. They had no understanding of germs or hygiene, and their hands, which would touch the sick and the dying, were a potent source of infection. The treatments in the hospital were the same ones you've become familiar with: bloodletting, purging and herbal concoctions. The barber surgeon would make his rounds, a terrifying figure with his bag of rusty tools. He would perform minor surgeries, lance boils and set broken bones, all without a hint of sterilisation. The sight of a surgery in the hospital ward would have been a common and deeply unsettling spectacle. A person with a broken leg might be lying next to a person who was having a tumour removed, and the screams of the patients would be a constant haunting sound. Now, for a truly quirky or fringe tidbit. One of the most common treatments in the Tudor hospital was the use of mummy powder. The belief was that the powdered remains of an Egyptian mummy had powerful healing properties. The mummy powder, often mixed with wine or water, was a highly sought-after and expensive remedy. It was believed to be a cure for everything from headaches to broken bones. The fact that a hospital would use powdered human remains as a cure is a testament to the sheer desperation and the profound lack of scientific understanding. The fact that the mummies were often faked, and the powder was often just a mix of dirt and ground bone, is a morbidly funny twist to an otherwise horrific reality. The hospital's hygiene, or lack thereof, was a major problem. The sheets would be rarely, if ever, changed. The chamber pots would be emptied into a communal cesspool, often located just outside the hospital walls, and the smell would have been overpowering. The surgeons would not wash their hands between patients, and the same tools would be used on a dozen different people. The hospital, in many ways, was a giant bacterial breeding ground, a place where a person with a minor ailment could easily contract a deadly infection. Historians still argue whether a sick person was better off in the hospital or in a ditch. The evidence suggests that for many the ditch might have been the safer option. The hospital was also a place of death. The death toll would have been incredibly high, and the sight of a death cart with its load of bodies would have been a common one. The hospital was a place of last rites, a place where the sick would come to die and the priest would come to administer the last sacrament. The hospital in many ways was a place of social control, a place where the sick poor were removed from the public eye and were left to die in a communal and often undignified way. As you walk in the streets, you can't help but feel a flicker of gratitude that you were not sent to the hospital. You are a survivor, a person who, through a stroke of luck, was able to recover in the comfort of your own home. The hospital, with its foul smells, its brutal treatments, and its horrifying lack of hygiene, was a place of pure terror. The thought of lying in a communal ward next to a person who was dying of a gruesome infection is a chilling one. You've survived the fever, the bloodletting, and the threat of the plague, but a stay in a Tudor hospital might have been the one thing that you couldn't have survived. It was a place where hope went to die, a place where the promise of Christian charity was often overshadowed by the grim reality of a lack of sanitation and a profound lack of medical understanding. The whispers of the dying in the hospital ward are a haunting sound, a reminder that in the Tudor era, the ultimate horror was not just a disease, but the place you went to be cured of it. You are back. The illness is a memory, the treatment's a thing of the past. The world around you, however, still carries the echoes of the medical era you've just experienced. You see the barber surgeon's pole, the apothecary's shop, the ghosts of the plague doctors in their bird-like masks. You've walked through the valley of Tudor medicine, and you've emerged on the other side, a person who is forever changed. As you reflect on your journey, you're reminded that the horrors and the wonders of this era left a profound legacy, a shadow that still lingers in our modern world. We're not just looking back at the past, we're looking at the roots of our present. The most profound legacy of Tudor medicine is the rise of the scientific method. While the era was a cesspool of quackery, superstition and brutal treatments, it was also a time of burgeoning curiosity. The anatomists, with their illegal cadavers, were the first to challenge the 1,000-year-old authority of Galen. They were the first to say, the ancient texts are wrong. The body is not what the books say it is. We must look for ourselves. This was the beginning of empiricism, the idea that knowledge comes from observation and experience, not from ancient authority. A mainstream historical fact is that the intellectual chaos of the Tudor era, with its competing theories and its brutal practicalities, was the perfect breeding ground for a new way of thinking about the body. The Tudor era also left a lasting legacy on the institutionalization of medicine. The creation of St. Bartholomew's Hospital and the other charitable institutions, while a place of horror, was also the beginning of the modern hospital system. It was the first time that a secular, organised system of care was created for the sick poor. The idea that a government or a charitable organisation had a responsibility to care for the sick was a radical one. It was a step away from the personal, individualised charity of the monasteries, and a step towards a more systemic, if not always humane, approach to public health. Now, for a truly quirky or fringe tidbit. The medical beliefs of the Tudor era lingered for centuries. As late as the 19th century, a common cure for a toothache was to rub the tooth with the foot of a dead mole. The belief in the healing power of animals and of folk magic was so deeply ingrained that it persisted long after the scientific revolution. The ghosts of the Tudor era were not just in the hospitals and the barber shops. They were in the kitchens and the cottages of the poor, in the remedies that were passed down from mother to daughter, a silent testament to an era that was more about faith than it was about facts. The most lasting legacy of the Tudor era, however, is a profound sense of humility. We've seen a time where the most learned men in the land were completely wrong about the most basic facts of the human body. We've seen a time where a king's power was no match for a simple infection. We've seen a time where the pursuit of beauty was a dance with death. This is a humbling lesson, a reminder that our own medical advancements, for all their brilliance, are not the final word. Our understanding of the body, our cures for diseases, our very definition of health is a product of our time, and in a few centuries our own medical practices might seem as barbaric and as bizarre as the Tudor ones. Historians still argue whether the medical advancements of the 17th and 18th centuries were a slow, linear progression, or a sudden, radical break from the past. The truth is likely a blend of both, a slow-burning fire that was sparked by the chaos and the curiosity of the Tudor era. You're a survivor, a person who has seen the true terrors of Tudor medicine. You've been bled, you've been purged, and you've been prescribed a remedy that was more likely to kill you than to cure you. But you've also seen the seeds of our modern world. You've seen the first glimmer of a scientific method, the first hint of an organised hospital system, and the first whisper of a different way of thinking about the body. The barber surgeon is gone, the apothecary is a pharmacist, and the physician is a scientist. But the ghost of the four humours still lingers. We still talk about a person being phlegmatic or melancholic. We still use words that are a direct link to a time of medical ignorance. The past is not gone, it is a part of our present. Now, as you sit here, with the gentle hum of the modern world around you, you can't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for a world with antibiotics, with anaesthesia, and with a clean, sterile hospital. You're a survivor of a different kind of horror, a horror that was not of a monster in a story, but of a medical system that was more about guessing than it was about knowing. The shadows of the Tudor era are long, and they are dark, but they are a reminder that our own world, for all its problems, is a place of light and of hope. The terrors of Tudor medicine are a story, a history, a memory. And for you, they are a nightmare that you have just managed to wake up from. This concludes our journey into the true terrors of Tudor medicine. Now close your eyes, let the soft hum of the fan and the gentle beat of your own healthy heart lull you into a peaceful slumber. The world of rusty tools, toxic cosmetics, and brutal purges is 1,000 years away. You're safe now. Breathe deeply, feel the softness of your blankets, and let the worries of the past fade into a calming darkness.